Okay, so now let's discuss about the different components of the fluid power system for the case of both hydraulic systems as well as pneumatic system. Let's talk about a hydraulic system. In case of the hydraulic system, we have three things which are needed for hydraulic power generation. First of all, we need a pump. The pump is going to generate the hydraulic power. But in order to generate the hydraulic power, the pump needs the fluid. So we need to have a tank reservoir at the atmospheric conditions. So the tank reservoir is going to supply the fluid so that the pump can actually uh, produce the hydraulic fluid power. But in order to run the pump, we need an electric motor. So these three devices or these three things are basically for the generation of hydraulic power, which is a pump, tank, and an electric motor. Now, once the hydraulic power is generated, the next thing are the controls. In order to control the flow of the hydraulic fluid, valves are used and pipings are used to actually make the flow and control the flow. So regarding the controls, piping and valves are basically used. And then the last thing is the transmission. For the case of the transmission, we normally have an actuator. The actuator is going to convert the fluid energy into mechanical force or torque. This is basically a piston cylinder device in most of the cases where we are actually using to produce the mechanical power using the fluid power. So these are the basic components of the hydraulic system. So you can see this in the form of a figure here. So what we have here is we have a tank or a reservoir. This tank is actually storing the fluid and is actually supplying the fluid to the pump. But in order to first the fluid to enter into the pump, the fluid has to go through a filter because this tank is actually open to atmosphere. So there are chances that there are some dirt or some debris are coming along with it. So in order to filter it so that it does not damage the pump, the pump is going to be connected with an electric motor. So the electric motor will be the one which will be driving the pump. The pump is going to produce the high pressure within this hydraulic fluid. Once the high pressure is produced, then it's going to pass through a pressure regulation device. The pressure regulation device ensures that the right amount of pressure is produced. And in case if pressure is produced larger than required, then some of the fluid is returned back so that the pressure is relieved and only the required amount of pressure passes onto the system. So we are going to have the pressure regulation. The pressure regulation is going to ensure that the right amount of pressurized fluid leaves the pumping system. And then this fluid pumping system, and then this pressurized fluid is going to pass through the control valve. Now the control valve is going to decide the direction of the flow. Okay, so suppose uh, if the control valve is adjusted in such a way that now for the case of the control valve, we have different ports. We have some of the ports on the fluid generation side, and then we have some of the ports on the fluid transmission side. Okay, on the generation side, we have a pressure port, okay, from where the pressurized fluid is coming, and then we have the port which is actually returning the fluid back to the tank. Okay, so we have the pressure port and then we have the tank port. On the case of the on the side of the uh, of of the fluid pressure transmission, we have let's say I call this port A, and then we'll have port B. Okay, so we have two ports here. Okay, so this is a piston cylinder device, which is actually an actuator. Now, in this case, we can have two different states where one state could be if we want to expand the cylinder. So when the cylinder is going to be expanded, the piston is going to move in the upward direction. And the other way is if we want to retract the cylinder. So when the cylinder is retracted, the piston is going to move in the downward direction. So this is for the case of expansion. This is for the case of retraction. Now, suppose if the pressurized fluid is arranged in such a way that it enters from the port P to port A, okay, then the fluid is going to enter into this region. And since this is a pressurized fluid, it's going to force the piston to move down. And basically the cylinder is going to be retracted. And as the cylinder will be retracted, so the fluid in the cylinder will be returning back from here. And so port B will be connected to the tank, to the port T. From there, it's going to return back into the tank. Okay, so this is one of the arrangement where the fluid, where the control valve is connected to port A and B of the actuator in such a way that the cylinder is being retracted. Okay, the other way around is that suppose if we want suppose if we want to have an expansion of the cylinder, so what we are going to do is we are going to connect the port P to port B. Okay, so in this way the pressurized fluid is going to enter into the cylinder. Okay, and as the pressurized fluid enter into the cylinder, it's going to push the piston upward, so the cylinder will go through an expansion, and the fluid on the top side of the piston is going to be returned from port A and will be connected to the port T. From here, it's going to return back into the tank. Okay, so just by ensuring the connection of port A to port B, port P to port A, and or port B, or similarly port T to port A or port B, but just by making this connection, we can actually ensure whether we want retraction of the cylinder or we want expansion of the cylinder. Suppose there is a load here at the other side of the piston, so whether the load will be lifted up or the load will be moving down depends upon whether the cylinder will be expanding or retracting, which will depend further whether the pressurized port will be connected from A or it will be connected to B. Okay, so this way the control valve actually controls the motion of the actuator. Okay, so it controls the direction, it controls the motion of the actuator. And then the third thing is basically basically the fluid transmission itself, which is in the form of the piston cylinder device. So this is basically a description of this is basically the description of the hydraulic system. So we can have an arrangement of control valve for the case of raising the load, or we can have the control valve for the case of lowering the load, or we can have a third position as well, where neither we want to raise the load nor we want to lower the load. In that case, we connect the pressure port with the exhaust, or you can say with the return port, okay, in such a way that the port A and port B are both blocked. So when the port A and port B are both blocked, so neither the more fluid can enter in the upper portion, nor any fluid can be removed from the lower portion, or vice versa. So in this way, neither the piston is going to move down nor the piston is going to move up, and it's going to stay at the same location. So this is the position of a control valve, where it will neither allow lowering of the load nor allow raising of the load, just keeping the load at the same location. So that's another third position. So anyways, this is how the hydraulic system works, and this is the basic functionality of the hydraulic system as shown here. Now let's discuss a little about the pneumatic system. Pneumatic system, since it will not be using the hydraulic oil, rather it will be using the pressurized air. So instead of using the pump, we are going to have the compressor. So the compressor will be there. The compressor is going to take the air from outside, but obviously the air might contain some dust or debris that might damage the compressor. So in order to ensure that no damage is done to the compressor, we first pass the air through the filter. So the filter is going to remove the dust or debris, and then we'll pass the air onto the compressor. Obviously, the compressor is going to be connected to an electric motor. So the electric motor is going to run the compressor. So once the compressor is running, so the compressor is going to produce the pressurized air. Now, there is one difference is that in case of okay, now we have to make the pressurized air to pass through an air cooler or air treatment. Why do we need air cooling? Because there is a possibility that there is moisture within the air, and the moisture in the air is going to damage the control valve. So we need only dry air to enter into the control valve. So by doing the air cooling, we are actually condensing whatever the moisture is there in the air and making it dry air. So that's why a little air treatment is needed after the compression as well. So then once the water is removed, then we put this dry pressurized air into a storage reservoir. Okay, there is one difference between the hydraulic and pneumatic system is that both requires storage. But if you look here, in case of the hydraulic system, storage is needed before the pumping. Okay, in case of pneumatic system, storage is needed after the high pressure after the high pressure pressurized air is generated. So the location of the storage is different in case of the hydraulic and pneumatic systems. In case of the hydraulic system, the storage is placed before the pump. In case of the pneumatic system, the storage is placed after the compressor. So once the storage is there, okay, what are the main functions of the storage reservoir here? Because this is the air system, and normally the gas systems or the air systems requires some time to produce the high pressure. So it's not instantly generated. So in order to produce a specific buffer so that the air is actually high pressure is produced, we need to have a storage reservoir before we supply the pressurized air to the control valve so that a continuous flow of high pressure is supplied. So from the storage reservoir, the pressurized air is going to be supplied to the control valve. Then after that, it's exactly the same way. We have a port P, which will be for the pressurized air. We'll have port T, which will be for the exhaust. Okay, so for the port P, we can connect the port P to A, or the port P could be connected to B, depending upon whatever the location of the whatever the uh, whatever the process we need at the transmission end, whether expansion of the cylinder or retraction of the cylinder. The other difference is that in case of the hydraulic system, since we are using hydraulic oil, so the return oil is going to be returned back to the tank. But here, since we are taking the air directly from the atmosphere, so the return is not going to go into any tank, rather the return is going to be exhausted out. So this is another difference between the hydraulic and pneumatic system. But that's the basic construction of the hydraulic piping system and the pneumatic fluid power system. So based on these two diagrams, you could be asked that what are the basic differences between the hydraulic and pneumatic system, systems, and you could also be asked to draw these diagrams. Okay, not with all these details, but the basic components, the basic functions you shall have to show. Okay, and you might be asked to describe the functions of each one of the component, and in that case you have to actually show how both the systems, hydraulic and the pneumatic systems, work. If anybody have any question regarding this, you are free to ask. This is another figure which is explaining the components of hydraulic and pneumatic systems. You can go through this. This is just a figurative approach of showing the different components and their operations. So components of the hydraulic pneumatic system, we have fluid, oil for hydraulic systems, air for pneumatics. Reservoir, we need to have storage tank, hydraulic pump, or in case of the pneumatics compressors, converts the mechanical energy into hydraulic energy by forcing fluid from the reservoir into the system. Fluid lines transport the fluid to and from the pump through the hydraulic system. Valves, we can have control pressure. Valves are there to control the pressure, direction, and flow rate of the hydraulic fluid. Then we can have the actuator for converting hydraulic energy into mechanical energy to do the work. This is the basic transmission part in these hydraulic pneumatic systems. Applications, there are a lot of applications. There are applications in the oil and gas drilling rigs. There are applications in different power vehicles, in the forklifts, in mid-sized to large tractors, in the doziers, in the hauler trucks, in the excavators, in different machining tools. So we have a lot of applications of these hydraulic pneumatic systems. Let's discuss a little about control. So when we talk about control, there are basic three types of control devices. We have direction control devices. We call it DCVs. So DCVs are very common terms used here. Okay, so DCVs are basically what? These are the direction control valves. This is just to control the fluid path. So direction control valves are further of three categories. One is the check valves. Check valves are there if we want to have a flow in one direction only, and in case if the reverse flow occurs, is going to stop the motion of the fluid flow. So these are not as the check valves. They keep a check on what is the direction of the flow. So that if the direction is in one direction, which is allowed, then it's going to allow. If the direction starts moving in the opposite way, then it's going to stop the flow. And then we have the shuttle valves. Shuttle valves, as the name implies, is allows one of the shuttle to pass through at one time. We're going to see the construction of these valves. Then we are the most common ones are basically two-way, three-way, or four-way DCVs, which are basically using spool. So we're going to look at the construction of this as well. Then these are basically the direction control valves, DCVs. Then we can also have the pressure control valves. Pressure control valves are normally there to protect the system sometimes, because we know that we need to produce very high pressure, whether it is in the pneumatic systems or in the case of the hydraulic systems. So if the pressures are generated much higher than the system itself, the system piping of the control valves could actually handle, then in that case, they might burst the system or they might actually destroy the system. So in order to protect the system, it is needed to have the pressure control valves, where the pressure control valve will only operate if the system pressure becomes higher than the required pressure. And then we can have the flow control valve. The flow control valve is going to control the amount of flow which could be allowed into the system. So they're the ones which will be controlling the speed. So in order to control the speed, we have the flow control valves. In order to protect the system, we need to have the pressure control valves, and DCVs are basically to control the fluid path. So again, from the exams point of view, there can be a lot of short questions that can come from this slide. That what are the different kind of control devices? Okay, if you want to protect the system, what kind of valves do we use? If you want to control the speed, what kind of valves do we use? If you want to control the fluid path, what kind of valves do we use? What is the difference between the check valves and the shuttle valves, and what are basically the DCVs? Okay, now let's discuss a little about DCVs. DCVs are basically the direction control valves. Okay, so the direction control valves, what happens is that in case of DCVs, we have different ports, okay, at two ends of the valves. So we have on one end, let's say that we have this is the valve. Let's say this is the DCV. Okay. Now on one end we have the pump. The pump is going to generate the power, pressurized fluid, and that pressurized fluid is going to be provided to one of the port. And let's say this port is P. Okay. On the other hand, we have the actuator, which is composed of a cylinder and which is composed of a piston, and obviously there will be two ports here from this. Okay, so one. So let's say this port is A, this port is B. Now here in DCVs, we have the most important thing is this. This is known as a spool. The spool is something which is going to block some of the ports and will allow some of the ports to be connected to the other port. Okay, so suppose if we have a situation like this, that in this case, if you look, the pressurized port where the high pressure fluid will be there is in this case will be connected to the port B. Okay, and this port B will be connected uh, to the actuator in such a way that once it is connected to port P, is going to uh, retract the cylinder. So in this case, is going to retract the cylinder, and whatever the fluid there in the other part of the cylinder is going to go back in this direction. So that will be the return of the fluid. This will be the supply of the fluid. Okay. So this is a specific uh, kind of a valve which is going to allow certain ports to be connected to certain ports. So in this case, this is the port T. Port T will be connected to port A, port P will be connected to port B, and so it will allow the cylinder to retract. Now, if we just push the spool in this direction, then the spool position might become like this, and now port P will be connected to port A instead of port B, and port B will be connected to port T. Okay, so just pushing the spool, we can position it in a way that we can change the direction of the fluid flow within this actuator. Okay, so this is the direction controlled valve controlled by the spool, positioning of the spool. So the spool of the DCV can be positioned. Okay, now how can we move the spool? The moving of the spool can be done manually, or it could be done mechanically, or by using a pilot pressure. Pilot pressure is what? We have the pressurized fluid. If we take a small amount of the pressurized fluid, if we take a bleed out of it and connect it to one of the side of the spool, is going to allow the or is going to make the spool move whenever we want it to move. So we can use a pilot pressure line to actually move the spool itself. Then we can use electrical solenoids to move the spool. So, but anyways, this is the basic description or the functioning of a direction control valve, basically operated by a spool. So suppose we have a situation like this, that we have an actuator here, and this actuator. Now, how do we represent it? How do we represent the DCVs on the diagram? So we represent the DCVs on the diagram based upon how many number of uh, positions of the spool we can have. So for example, if we can have two positions of the spool as shown here. So in one position of the spool, P is connected to B. In the other position of the spool, P is connected to A. Okay. So in that case, what we are going to do is we are going to draw two boxes. Okay. Okay. So each box represents one position of the spool. Now, once we draw the two boxes, on one of the box, we are going to show where the pressurized fluid is there and where the tank is located. Okay. On the other side, we are going to show which port is connected to the cylinder and which port is connected to the retraction side. Okay, which port is connected to the return side. So first is the default position. So in case of the default position, of the spool, it is always shown that what is the default position. Suppose in this case, if the default position is such that P is connected to B and A is connected to T. Okay, so here we have A, here we have B, here we have P, and this is T. Okay, so suppose this is a default position that we want in the default position that the cylinder be retracted. Okay, so we can show the default position like this. Then the second position is this position where we actually want the actuation to be done. That means we want the cylinder to be expanded. Okay, so in that case, P will be connected to A. So it's just shown here by a straight line. Okay, and the other B will be connected to T. So it's being shown here by this straight line. Okay, the dotted lines here shows that a pilot pressure is used to actually move the position of the spool. Okay, so this is how diagrammatically we can actually show the working of the DCV. Now this is for the case of two positions DCV. So it has 4 ports. So we have P port, we have T port, we have A port, we have B port. So it has 4 ports and 2 positions. This is position 1, this is position 2. Okay, this is port 1, port 2, port 3, port 4. Okay, so it has 2 positions and 4 ports. So it's basically said 4 by 2 DCV. So it is said 4 by 2 DCV. Suppose we have 4 by 3 DCV valve. So in that case, we have 3 positions. So first in the center, we are going to show where our pressurized line is. Then we can show where our tank is connected. And then we can have the 2 different ports of the actuator. Okay, so we can show here that in case when we want the cylinder to expand, okay, then how will be the connection? What will be the positioning of the spool? In that case, P will be connected to A and T will be connected to B. So that's one position. Okay, the second position is that when we want to retract the cylinder, so in that case, P will be connected to B and A will be connected to T. So it's going to be shown here as a second position. And third position is when we neither want it to extend or nor we want it to retract, rather we want it to be at the same position as is it. Okay, in that case, we are going to connect P directly to T. Okay, and the port A and B will be will not be connected at all. So they will be blocked. So in that case, neither the fluid can leave the cylinder nor it can enter the cylinder. And so the position of the piston would remain the same. Okay, so this is basically the 3 different positions of a spool can have 3 different effect in the fluid flow transmission. Okay, so this is basically a 3 position spool. And since we have 4 ports, one port is P, other port is T, and one third port is A, fourth port is B. So we have 4 ports, 3 positions. So this is known as a 4 by 3 valve. Okay, so one thing that you should know is how do we write a valve? When we write here 4 by 3 DCV, what does it mean? How many ports does it have? How many positions it has? Okay, so you should know that which number represents what. So if it is written 4 by 3 valve DCV, then 4 means the ports, 3 means the positions of the spool, and DCV means it's a direction control valve. Okay, now in this case, we can have a spring which might be which might be controlling the position of the piston in the default condition. Okay, so then it would be shown here with the help of a spring drawn by the sides, or we can have a mechanical lever which can actually control the positioning of the spool. So this is actually an example of 4 by 3 DCV. Previous was the example was of 4 by 2 DCV. Okay, we can have single acting and double acting cylinders. Suppose if we have a cylinder like this, where we have just one inlet into the cylinder. So when the pressurized fluid is going to when the pressurized fluid is going to enter into the cylinder, it's going to expand this piston. It's going to expand the piston. And in case if the pressure is removed, then the spring is going to push the piston back. So it's going to retract the cylinder. Or maybe not the piston, maybe some force of gravity there, which is pushing the piston to move downwards and might retract the cylinder. So this is a single acting because it has only one port. Okay, so if we have one port here, then it's single acting. Suppose if we have two ports in case of the piston cylinder device, we have A and B. So we can have we can push the fluid towards from A, or we can push the fluids from B. So that will allow the piston to move in the right direction or the left direction, or to extend the cylinder or retract the cylinder. In that case, this is known as the double acting. In double acting, the pressurized fluid can be there on both sides of the piston, can be provided to both sides of the piston. But in single acting, pressurized fluid can only be provided on one side of the piston. So that's the difference. So if this can also be asked in the exam, what is the difference between single acting and a double acting actuator or cylinder? Okay, so in single acting cylinder, okay, the pressurized fluid can only be supplied to one side of the piston. In case of the double acting cylinder, the pressurized fluid can be supplied to both sides, to either side of the piston. So this is the difference between the single acting cylinder and the double acting cylinder. Okay, let's have a break at this point, and then we are going to start back after the break.